Hello again, everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining us again for our second Immigrants Rising webinar. Like I mentioned before, my name is Ileana Perez, not Dean Santos, but he is part of our team. E4FC's Entrepreneurship Initiatives Manager, spearheading Immigrants Rising, which is an initiative to promote entrepreneurship opportunities for all immigrants, regardless of legal status. So before I begin the webinar, just a few housekeeping items. Everyone is muted to ensure optimal audio quality. I will go through the entire presentation and answer questions at the end, but you can feel free to just ask questions throughout, but I won't get to answer them until the very end. Please note that when I do get a chance to ask those the questions, I may skip more individualized questions that may require more research, but so please do not get offended. If I'm unable to get to your question, or if you don't get a chance to ask a question, you will get an opportunity to ask your questions in the webinar evaluation survey, which you will receive shortly after we complete the webinar. I encourage you to complete the survey to ask questions, provide feedback to help us improve future webinars. Everybody should have received a handout. It was sent about an hour ago, which I will reference throughout the presentation. So the handout has important links and resources that I will mention throughout the webinar. If you did not get the handout, please let me know. Please email me, and I will definitely make sure to send it. This webinar is being recorded, and I will send a link to the recording and the handout in a follow-up email. We also recorded the last webinar, so if you missed it, feel free to email me and we can send you a link to that recording and to the handout for that recording as well. All of our webinars and materials and everything else we produce will be available in our Immigrants Rising webpage that will launch in May. And I'd also like to thank our legal partner organizations that have been supporting us the entire way with the production of our materials. The National Immigration Law Center, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. I'd also like to thank our team members, Dean Santos, Maritza Quiroz, who really provide so much help in the creation of these webinars. There's a lot of work that happens behind the scenes, and there's definitely no way I'd be able to do this all on my own. And of course, a big shout out to Kathy Jin, who helps me brainstorm, who replies to my late night text messages, and really makes this entire initiative come to life. So with that, I am going to go ahead and start the webinar. Okay, so here is a list of all our upcoming webinars. So for the next webinar in April, it's going to be Choosing a Business Structure. We're actually going to have a guest speaker, Carla Reyes. So we're really excited about that. And we're also looking to partner with other individuals in different organizations for our next webinars as well. And then, as I mentioned before, we do plan to launch our webpage sometime in May, and hopefully coordinate an Immigrants Rising conference sometime in the summer. So definitely stay tuned for that. So this is the agenda for today's webinar. So I'm going to be talking, providing more details about the ITIN. I'm going to give an introduction to what the EIN is. I'm going to be talking about how to file your taxes as an independent contractor, talk a little bit about expenses and deductions, the importance of managing cash flow and saving for taxes as an independent contractor, and providing some updates for the current tax season. So this is all really intended to give you a very general overview of how to file taxes as somebody that's just starting off doing work as an independent contractor. I am definitely not a tax expert, but I have been doing my taxes with the help of tax specialists for a few years now as an independent contractor. So I'll be able to share some of my personal tips. So I'm going to begin to talk a little bit, give a little bit of history about the ITIN and some of the most recent changes. So several changes have been made to the ITIN application and process since its inception in 1996. Since 2003, the IRS began to tighten its standards for issuing ITINs by requiring tax returns as proof that the ITIN would be used for tax administration purposes. But since the passage of the Tax Hike Act of 2015, or the PATH Act, ITINs that have not been used on a federal tax return at least once in the last 3 years are no longer valid for use on a tax return unless renewed by a taxpayer. In addition, ITINs issued prior to 2013 and not used on a federal tax return in the last 3 years need to be renewed starting October of last year based on a rolling renewal schedule. And starting in summer of 2016, so summer of last year, the IRS began mailing letter 5821 to individuals holding ITINs with the middle digits of 78 or 79, informing the individuals that they need to renew their ITIN. So as you can see on the slide, you can see an example of what numbers are up for renewal. So some of the most frequently asked questions in relation to the renewal of ITINs are, so what happens once an ITIN is renewed? So once an ITIN is renewed, an ITIN will remain in effect unless it is not used in a tax return for 3 consecutive years. And so what happens if you don't renew your ITIN? So some individuals may actually not be aware that their ITIN has expired or that they must renew an expired ITIN. According to the IRS, returns filed by these individuals will be accepted by the IRS. However, there may be a delay in processing some of the returns and credits, such as the child tax credit and the American Opportunity Tax Credit. This could result in a reduced refund or additional penalties and interests. The IRS will notify these filers about the delay and any reduction in refunds and credits claimed, and will inform them about the need to file Form W-7 to renew their ITIN. In addition, according to the National Immigration Law Center, or NILC, the disadvantage to not renewing is that an individual who earns the threshold amount of income in a tax year that triggers the filing requirement is required by law to file a tax return, and we need an ITIN to do so. Records of tax filings can also be helpful and are actually sometimes sought by immigration law judges during the immigration adjustment process. So for more information on the benefits for immigrants of filing and income tax returns, you can check out NILC's guide, Individual Taxpayer Identification Number, a powerful tool for immigrant taxpayers. And the link to that guide is in the handout that I provided. So a bit of information about the confidentiality of ITIN information. Let me see, I think I may have skipped a slide. No, that's the recent changes. Okay, so the ITIN information is partially protected by Internal Revenue Code 6103, which generally prohibits the IRS from disclosing taxpayer information, including to other federal agencies. However, there are important exceptions that everyone should be aware of. In general, the IRS is required to disclose taxpayer information to state agencies responsible for tax administration, to law enforcement agencies for investigation and prosecution of non-tax criminal laws, or to powers of attorney and other designees. It's important to know, for the most part, under current law, information on the ITIN is protected from being shared with other federal agencies, including immigration agencies. According to NILC, to change the confidentiality of tax-related information, including ITIN information, Congress would have to change the law, as the confidentiality protections are codified in the IRS Code 6103. The IRS historically has been very invested in maintaining the confidentiality of its information, since the IRS does not want to see the reduction in tax revenue that would result if the confidentiality protections were weakened. Therefore, undocumented immigrants should note that there is some risk associated with applying and filing for an ITIN. Okay, so an individual with an expired ITIN who has obtained or become eligible for a Social Security, for example, through DACA, should not renew the ITIN and should discontinue using it. It is actually improper to be using both the ITIN and the Social Security number assigned to the same person to file tax returns. And I know I talked a little bit about this in the first webinar. It is your responsibility to notify the IRS so it can combine all of your tax records under one identification number. If you do not notify the IRS when you are assigned a Social Security number, you may not receive credit for all the wages paid and taxes withheld, which could reduce the amount of any refund due. Individuals who become eligible to obtain a Social Security number, so for example, DACA recipients or permanent residents, should obtain a Social Security number from the Social Security Administration, or write a letter explaining that you now have been assigned a Social Security number and when your tax records combined. So in your handout, I did include a link to a sample letter that you may use, that you may modify and use for yourself. And in addition to sending a letter to the IRS, you may also send letters to the credit agencies requesting to change your ITIN to a Social Security number. And I also included a link to that letter for your reference. So now, in addition to the Social Security number or the ITIN, an individual may choose to apply for what's called an Employer Identification Number, or an EIN. The EIN, also known as a Federal Tax Identification, is a unique 9-digit number assigned by the IRS and is used to identify a business entity. Similar in purpose to the Social Security number assigned to individuals, EINs are used by employers, sole proprietors, corporations, partnerships, nonprofit organizations, trust and estates, government agencies, certain individuals, and other business entities. And you can actually use a Social Security number or an ITIN to get an EIN. So how do you determine if you need to get an EIN? So basically, you need to answer yes to any of the questions that are listed on the slide. So if you're interested in hiring employees as an independent contractor or as a business owner, then you need to get an EIN. If you're operating your business as a corporation or a partnership, then you would get an EIN. And some of the other points listed on here. Nonprofit organizations definitely have to get an EIN. And I won't go into detail in this webinar about the different types of business structures, such as partnerships, corporations, LLCs. That'll be a conversation for the next webinar. But this is just to give you a basic introduction as to the EIN, since the ITIN, Social Security number, and EIN are all used to file taxes. And I see a few questions pop up, but like I mentioned before, I will get to all of the questions once I finish the presentation. I'll leave about 15 minutes for questions at the end. So how do you apply for an EIN? You can apply for an EIN online, by fax, or mail, depending on how soon you need to use the EIN. Applying for an EIN is a free service offered by the IRS, so definitely be on the lookout for websites that charge for this service. So in order to apply online, it's probably the best way to apply for an EIN online. You can visit the IRS website and use the EIN application. A link to the application is also found in your handout. Once the application is completed, the information is validated during the online session, and an EIN is issued immediately. So very effective way to get an EIN if you need one right away. The online application process is available for all entities whose principal business is located in the U.S. or within U.S. territories. The principal officer, general partner, grantor, or owner needs to have a valid TIN number, tax ID number, or a Social Security number in order to use the online application. So again, very important to know that to get an EIN, you can use either the Social Security number or an ITIN if you are not eligible to receive a Social Security number. And I won't go into too many details about fax or mail, but basically if you want to get an EIN through fax or mail, you do have to complete the SS4 application. A link to that is also on the handout. If you do it online, you do not have to complete the SS4 form. So just some things to consider when looking to get an EIN. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to actually filing taxes as an independent contractor. Again, so very important to note that this is just a very generic sort of overview of how you would file taxes as a first-timer having done work as an independent contractor. Taxes get a lot more complicated with any other business structure. Like I mentioned before, like a partnership or an LLC or anything else, a lot more to consider. But this is just to give you a very general overview of what to expect. So really, the number one thing to do is to organize and prepare ahead of time. So the first thing is definitely to look for a reliable tax preparer or an accountant, especially if it's your first time filing as an independent contractor. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some tips to looking for a reliable tax preparer. You need to be prepared to pay both federal and state taxes. So there are some online tax bracket calculators that you can use to figure out how much you would be paying. So the differences between an employee and an independent contractor is that as an employee, your employer is responsible for a portion of those taxes, and it's automatically taken out with in every one of your checks, whereas an independent contractor, you get paid the full amount. So that means that you're held responsible to pay for all of those taxes. So it's important to just be aware that you will need to be paying these taxes. I know it may be, it'll get really exciting when you get those checks, but just you have to keep in mind that you have to be paying a portion of those checks. And I'll talk a little bit more about everything that needs to be paid. So you should definitely organize all of your income, both as an employee, if you're working as an employee with work authorization, and as an independent contractor. So in my case, I am currently employed as an employee. I am a DACA recipient, so I have a work authorization to work as an employee, but I also work as an independent contractor. So at the end of the year, what I've been doing now actually is organizing all of the W-2s I receive for my work done as an employee. I'm actually employed by different organizations to work as an employee, and I do independent contractor work on the side. So every year I end up with about 3 different W-2s and multiple 1099s for work done as an independent contractor. So even throughout the year, I'm very careful about making sure I keep track of all my independent contractor work, keeping track of all the W-9s I'm submitting to the different clients, keeping track of all the checks I'm receiving. You will only receive the 1099s from clients who you have made business with $600 or more. However, you still need to report income even for small jobs that are done separately. So again, in the first webinar, I talked a little bit about some of these forms, so I will go over them in a couple of slides just to give you a general breakdown of all the forms that are needed to file your taxes. Another thing that you need to organize and prepare are your business expenses. So this is something that actually no one ever told me when I started working as an independent contractor, that I can actually have expenses and deductions. So in a couple of slides, I'll be talking specifically about these business expenses and deductions. Something else that is recommended is to pay quarterly estimated taxes. So this is really for individuals who are expected to pay $1,000 or more when you file an annual return. And in order to pay these quarterly estimates, you can use the IRS Form 1040 to file your estimated taxes, and a link to this form is provided in your handout. There are 2 different ways that you can pay. You may pay using the federal government online payment system or direct pay, and the links to both of those are also provided in the handout. And again, this is just very general overview of how one might begin to organize to pay for your taxes as an independent contractor. Okay, so similar to immigration services, you should be very careful when choosing a taxpayer. You don't want to become a victim to any scheme that offers unrealistic wealth or exemption from your obligations to file tax returns and/or pay taxes. Most taxpayers probably provide excellent and honest service to their clients, but there are a few unscrupulous tax return preparers that file false and fraudulent tax returns and ultimately defraud their clients. So it's important to know that even if someone else prepares your return, you are ultimately responsible for all the information on the tax return, which is why it is very important to choose your tax preparer wisely. So this is actually a checklist offered by the IRS when looking for a tax preparer. So you definitely want to, Google those persons' qualifications, make sure that they actually know what they're doing. Check the tax preparer's history. Now there are a lot of websites that actually rate some of these individuals to see, to make sure that you're working with someone that's trustworthy. Find out about the service fees ahead of time. You don't want to be overpaying either. Ask if they offer electronic filing. That really expedites the process in terms of submitting your taxes. Make sure the tax preparer is accessible. So you really want to make sure that you have a close relationship with this person, in the sense that you can call them or send them a text message, send them an email if you have any questions. Definitely, for folks who are doing taxes for the first time as an independent contractor, you will definitely have a lot of questions. So you want to make sure that that person is accessible and can answer questions in an adequate time. You do need to provide all records and receipts needed to prepare your return. So again, very important to think about this before looking for the tax preparer. Never sign a blank return. You always want to make sure that everything is on there, want to be double checking everything. You want to make sure you're reviewing and signing everything ahead of time. So that's why it's important to, you may not necessarily have to know all the forms that are necessary. You may not necessarily know exactly what needs to be there, but at least just knowing what the forms look like and the type of information that you will be asked to get, at least just to have an idea to make sure that everything on your taxes is correct. And then make sure that once the tax preparer does complete your taxes, that the tax preparer provides his or her tax identification number. This way, if any questions come up about who filed this, you can directly point to that person. Okay. So here's an overview of all the different forms that you need to file your taxes. So in the last webinar, I talked about the W-9 1099 form, but just to briefly go over them again. So the W-9 form is the form that you will be asked to submit by clients or by different clients for them to keep track of how much money they are paying you. So again, this form can be requested by all the different clients that you work with. So you might be submitting, anywhere from 1 to 5 to 10 different W-9 forms, depending on the number of clients that you're working with. This is the form that would take the place of an I-9. An I-9 is the one that is submitted as an employee that requires work authorization and validation of identity. Whereas the W-9 form simply asks for your name, address, the type of business structure that you have, or whether you're working as an independent contractor, and either a social security number or a tax ID number. Again, this one does not ask at all for work authorization. And I explained this in much more detail in webinar number 1. So the 1099 form is a summary of how much a client or the number of clients paid you if it is more than $600. So at the end of the year, you will get the same number of 1099s as the number of W-9s that you submitted, which is why it's very important to keep track of who you've been sending these W-9 forms, so you can keep track of how many 1099 forms you are receiving. Again, you are not responsible for doing anything with the 1099 form. That is the responsibility of your clients to mail to you. And this is the form that you use to file your taxes. And then in addition to that, some of the other forms, really your tax preparer is the one that should be keeping track of these forms and should be much more familiar with them. But this is just for you as an individual to know what forms are used when reporting taxes as an independent contractor. So the form that is used to report self-employment income is Form 1040, and all the links to everything I'm talking about here are available in the handout. The next form that I'm going to talk about is the Schedule C Easy form. So this is the form that is used to calculate your net profit from businesses. So this is typically used for smaller businesses with expenses of less than $5,000. This is used if you don't have any employees, if you don't have physical inventory, and if you're not depreciating or deducting cost of your home. And I'll talk a little bit more about expenses in the next slide so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. And then the Schedule C form is basically the same as the previous form, but it's used for more complex businesses. And it's used to calculate the profit or loss from a business. And all of this is what ultimately gives a final number for you to pay taxes on. And then lastly, there's Schedule SE form, which is used to determine how much you pay in Social Security and Medicare taxes in addition to the income tax. So again, very important to know that as an employee, your employer typically pays a portion of your income tax, also pays for some Social Security or Medicare taxes, whereas an independent contractor, you're responsible to pay for all of that. So really important, again, to understand that once you begin to do work as an independent contractor, that has to be in the back of your mind, that at all times you need to know that you have to pay taxes either at the end of the year or quarterly, depending on how much money you're making. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about expenses and deductions. So expenses and deductions are very important because at the end of the year, from your income, you can actually include expenses and deductions that will lower your income, that will lower the percent of taxes that you need to pay. So this can get a little bit tricky and complicated because the eligible expenses and deductions vary by the type of business that you have, the type of business structure. So it does require working with a tax preparer who is familiar with how to handle this, and also, again, who is familiar with the type of business that you are conducting. But in general, this gives you a general overview of what some eligible expenses and deductions are. So in general, advertising expenses, so if you're doing maybe some Facebook marketing, if you're doing business cards, anything like that to promote your business, that can be used as an expense. Business insurances, depending again on the type of business you have. Interest paid on business credit card, on business loans, can also be expensed. Professional services, so if you hire a lawyer for some type of consulting, accountants, tax preparers, so all those fees could actually become part of your business expenses. Requests for equipment, so anytime you send your computer, your cell phone, anything that you're using for your business for repair, that also counts as an expense. Office supplies, pretty much anything that you can think of in terms of office supplies that can help you in your individual business can count as a business expense. Travel costs, so I do quite a bit of travel when I do consult with individuals, so I expense a mileage fee on my car as well as some of the expenses related to my car. But in addition to that, if you have to fly or any type of lodging, that could also become an expense. Business meals and other entertainment are also, you can also count as an expense. You can do 50% of business meals and entertainment as an expense. And other ones that I recently found out about actually are student loan interest deductions. So I am paying a small student loan, and so the interest on that I can actually deduct from my taxes. There are also additional tax benefits for education. And so I put in the handout specific links that talk more about these different types of deductions to determine whether or not you're eligible. And then one thing I did want to make a note of is that undocumented immigrants are exempt from the Affordable Care Act tax penalty. So the next slide is about the importance of managing cash flow and saving for taxes. So as I mentioned before, as an independent contractor, at the end of the year, you will be held responsible for paying your taxes, and for paying, maybe additional liabilities. So here are just sort of some tips to help you manage your tax liabilities at the end of the year. So one of the first things that you want to do is that you are making sure you're charging enough as an independent contractor to cover business expenses and taxes. So it's important to determine your hourly rate and billable hours. So I did include a link to how you might want to do something like this. So you do have to include, how much it is that you need to be that you need to make in order to pay for all of your taxes and liabilities. And then, I mean, there's a whole other calculation that you can do to determine how many hours you actually have to be billing per year to be able to meet everything that you have to pay. I suggest creating a budget to plan estimated expenses and revenues. So I typically do about a monthly budget where I include all my expenses and then figure out how much I need to be making. So, which is why, you know, it's really almost a balancing act when you're working as an employee, if your work authorization, and as an independent contractor, because now I sort of manage my time that I can work as an employee and my time that I work as an independent contractor. Before, when I used to do only independent contractor work, I really had to think about, okay, how do I need to, you know, increase my clients or increase the work I'm doing to offset all of my expenses. So I definitely recommend creating a monthly budget if you can, to figure out how much it is that you need to be making, or whether you need to sort of ramp up on your independent contractor work. You may also want to forecast to keep your finances in check. So in addition to having a monthly budget, you know, try to forecast a couple of months ahead, just so you can, you know, have, you know, a little bit of cushion room when thinking about how much money it is that you need to be saving or how much money you need to be making. Track your cash flow by keeping track of when you're expected to get paid and when you need to pay your liabilities. So another sort of, you know, challenge with working as an independent contractor is that, you know, you don't know, you know, it may take some time for some of your clients to pay you. So, you know, there may be some paperwork that needs to be processed, that needs to go through different parties within a company. So you need to be sort of keeping track of that with all the different clients that you have. It is recommended for you to set aside at least 25% of your earned income to pay taxes. And again, this is the part where, you know, it's really important that you are charging the correct amount of money per hour, because, you know, you are going to be getting, you know, all these great checks, but you have to be aware of the fact that you do have to set money aside, whether you like it or not, to pay for those taxes quarterly or at the end of the year. So one of the tips I suggest is perhaps opening a savings account specifically for tax purposes. And there are actually lots of great resources online that you can check out that can help you budget specifically for taxes. So, you know, you can even do a Google search for services that help you save money, or that automatically can give you an estimate of how much money you need to be putting aside depending on how much money is coming in. And then another tip is to be careful with credit cards and interest rates. So as an independent contractor, you can get credit cards, you can get credit loans. Once you expand into a business, you can get business loans, but you know, it's always just important to keep track of the interest rates and to keep track of, you know, how much money you're putting into that. And just lastly, I wanted to give you some updates for the current tax season. So the tax filing deadline is a few days later. It's typically on April 15th. It's now on April 18th, which gives us all a few extra days to file our taxes. Anybody who does have an ITIN and needs to renew, it is suggested that, you know, you renew as soon as possible to avoid refund delays. And then another thing specifically for independent contractors is that the standard mileage was revised to 54 cents per mile, down from 57.5 cents in 2015. So again, this is important to know because when you're calculating your expenses. It's also important to know that there may be other changes for the following year with the new administration. So it's just really important, once you begin doing work as an independent contractor, it's just really important to keep up with all the updates. Like I said, your tax preparer or your accountant should be fully aware of this, but it doesn't hurt for you to know what the forms look like, to know, you know, have sort of a ballpark estimate of how much you're supposed to be paying in taxes, and be aware of all the updates. So again, this was really intended to provide a very general overview for anyone who is considering doing work as an independent contractor, just to give you a heads up about what's to come in terms of taxes and what's to come in terms of saving the right amount of money and forecasting and keeping a budget for your income. So at this time, I actually ended a little bit early. So at this time, I'm going to start looking through some of your questions and see what comes up. Okay. Okay, so somebody asked if I can share the link to the sample letter again. So all of the links that I mentioned throughout the webinar are actually on the handout. So the handout was emailed about an hour ago. If you did not get the handout, feel free to email me. I will actually put in my contact information now. So my contact information is on here. You can email me at Ileana@e4fc.org. You can follow me on all the social media platforms. And there is an ITIN guide available on E4FC's website that has all this, it has a lot of detailed information about the ITIN. And then our new entrepreneurship content will become available eventually in the Immigrants Rising webpage. And again, I'll mention again, if anybody missed webinar number 1, you can feel free to email me as well, and I can send you a link to the recording and to the handout that was created for that. What about honorariums? One has to report those. That's a good question. I may have to get back to you on that one about honorariums, whether or not you have to report those. Okay, what if an employer asks, why do you want a 1099 versus a W-2? Okay, so there seems to be a little bit of confusion about the different forms. Okay, so again, so the W-9 is intended to take the place of a W-2 if an individual without work authorization is interested in doing independent contractor work. So I talked about the differences between an employee and an independent contractor work in webinar number 1, so I definitely suggest reviewing webinar number 1 to understand the differences between a W-9 and an I-9, and the differences. And then, so the 1099 comes as a response to a W-9 that is submitted. And my good friend Jorge Alvarez, who is very aware of taxes, says yes, that honorariums are considered income. So he was able to answer that question for us. So how do I know if my ITIN is expired? So you will get a letter in the mail. So right now it's based on a numbering system. So I'll quickly go back to the original. Okay, so on this slide, so letter 5821 was mailed to individuals holding ITINs with the middle digits of 78 and 79. So so these are the numbers that are going to be renewed, and from then on it's just going to continue. But you will get a letter stating that. If you do not get a letter, you can still file your taxes, and you will likely get a letter back saying that you need to renew. So definitely you will know at some point or another whether your ITIN needs to be renewed. So have to make separate. Yeah, so does an independent contractor have to make separate Social Security payments? So again, yes. So an independent contractor is definitely held liable to pay for all sorts of taxes because there is no one else that is paying for a portion of that. As an employee, your employer does pay a portion of all the taxes and Medicare and everything else, whereas an independent contractor, you are solely held responsible to pay for that. Again, it's very important to talk to your tax preparer or an accountant so that person can give you specific information about what your tax bracket is. It varies. The state tax, of course, varies by state. So that has a lot to do with it. Your marital status, whether or not you have children, all goes into that. So that's why, again, I highly recommend working with a tax expert to give you the correct numbers as to what your tax liability is. What if an undocumented person has never filed their taxes but wants to pay them? What should they do? You should definitely visit a tax preparer. Again, I gave some tips about what for when looking for a tax preparer, but it is never too late to pay for your taxes. So definitely encourage any person, regardless of immigration status, to pursue that option and get those taxes done. Is an independent contractor the same as a tech company? You can work as an independent contractor at a tech company, but you can also work as an employee. So I think I may be misunderstanding the question. If a company is hiring an intern, does that mean that that person is an independent contractor as well? Some internships may be considered employees, so that is really a question for the company who is looking either to hire an employee or is looking to work with independent contractors. And I did give some tips also in webinar 1 about how to talk to potential clients about working as an independent contractor. As an independent contractor, is it better to file taxes quarterly or yearly? So it is recommended to file taxes quarterly if you're expected to pay over $1,000 in expenses. So it really depends on how much money you're making as an independent contractor. The more you make, the better it is to just pay your taxes quarterly, so that at the end of the year, you're not paying a lump sum for the entire amount that you made over the year. Okay, and then there's some more questions in the chat, which I will open. Oh, let me see. Okay, there were more questions out here. Okay. Oh, come on. Okay, so anyone with an ITIN can get a credit card for the purposes of building credit. That is a great question. So yes, you can get access to a credit card using an ITIN. At one of the webinars, not the next one, but the one after that, we'll talk about building credit with an ITIN or with a social security number and getting access to financial capital for your business. So yes, individuals, regardless of immigration status, can get access to credit cards and build credit. And that's a good point. My good friend Jorge says that some companies or some banks allow you to get a credit card with an ITIN while others do not. So yes, it's definitely up to the companies, but we definitely know of banks that do provide credit cards and business loans to individuals regardless of legal status. Okay, and then there was a question about if you're making money while living outside of the country. So if you reside in the U.S. and are making and had income from outside of the U.S., you do have to declare that amount in your tax return. So the way it works, anytime you're doing business in the U.S., whether you're in the U.S. or you're outside of the U.S., you do have to pay your taxes. That is the whole purpose of the ITIN in the first place. So the ITIN is really intended for foreign individuals who want to do business in the U.S. to pay your taxes. So this is why any individual, regardless of legal status, can get access to an ITIN because the government wants any individual wanting to do business in the U.S. to pay their taxes. Okay, and let me move back to the question. Is there a work limit for the 1099? No problem. There is no, so as an independent contractor, you can bill, and again, you're not employed. So, I mean, there are definitely a lot of rules and regulations when you are working as an employee. You know, there's the whole thing about working a certain number of hours and getting paid overtime. There are limits to the number of hours you can work continuously in a day. As an independent contractor, that completely changes. You are your own boss. You are in charge for the number of hours that you work. You are in charge for the amount of money that you charge per hour. So you can work as much as you want. I recently, although, read an article about how the gig economy is really burning out a lot of individuals. So a lot of folks who are doing like Uber, in addition to being employees or in addition to their independent contractor, are actually burning out because there is no limit. You can work as much as you can. So I definitely encourage, having a balance in terms of how much work you're doing, both as an independent contractor, as an employee, or as a combination. That's probably something that I should consider, since I do a combination of many employee jobs and many independent contractor positions. Let's see. What if Okay, so somebody had sort of a similar question along those lines. What if you work more than 40 hours a week or more than 8 hours per day as an independent contractor? So again, very important to see that there's a very clear distinction between an employee as an independent contractor. Being an employee has a lot of restrictions in terms of how much work you need to be doing. And again, it goes along with your employer having liability with taxes. Independent contractor is completely separate from that. So again, you can work as much as you want. You can charge as much as you want, of course, within the limits of what it is of the type of service that you're providing. But again, very different from an employee, which I think oftentimes for individuals who maybe have not thought about working as an independent contractor, it's really a change in mindset that you are not working for somebody else, you are working for yourself and you are selling your services. So again, for anybody that has any questions about that, that is talked about in much more detail in webinar number 1. Let's see, any other questions that come up? And again, just to repeat myself, this webinar is being recorded. And at the end of the webinar, I will send out the recording as well as the handout. And if anybody is interested in learning more about entrepreneurship opportunities, our Immigrants Rising initiative is intended to really research all of these opportunities and share all those opportunities with all of you. So we're very excited about launching our website and really sharing more content. We are looking to create smaller guides that can be downloaded, whether it's for individuals that may have questions about independent contracting, about taxes, about business structures, about accessing financial capital. So we have a lot going on. But again, we thought that it would be best to slowly disseminate all the information that we have and build a website specifically to upload all this great information. We are also looking to eventually, hopefully, provide this information to different languages. We're also in discussions about doing a webinar to support family members. So we received a lot of requests about individuals looking to help their parents who are business owners and are looking to expand their business or have questions about expanding their businesses. So that's something else that's in the pipeline. Yes, somebody said in Spanish. Yes, we're very excited about, and not just in Spanish, but really being able to translate our materials to different languages. Again, all this will take time, but it's something that we are keeping in mind and very excited about continuing to do this work. So another question that came up, do you have to pay into Social Security separately from paying taxes? Yes, so that's why I did mention, let me go to the slide that talked a little bit about, let me double check. So there's Schedule SC form, which a link to that is in the handout, but that is used to determine how much you pay in Social Security and Medicare taxes in addition to your income tax. So yes, there are a lot of different taxes that you need to pay for on your own that would normally be paid by an employer if you were hired as an employee. Another question, can I send you questions through email? Yes, please send me any other questions on my email. I will scroll back to my contact information. All of my contact information is also found in the handout, but my email is iliana@e4fc.org. And I'll answer a few more questions before I log off. Are there ITIN cards? I know my number, but I never got the card. So last I heard, it's not necessarily a card, it's a document that the IRS sends out. I would recommend connecting directly with the IRS to ask about that form that should have your ITIN listed on there. And again, just to repeat myself in regards to, DACA recipients or permanent residents who may now have a Social Security number, very important to know that you need to be using that Social Security number and not the ITIN. You need to discontinue the use of the ITIN and let the IRS and the credit bureaus know that you now have a Social Security number. So if we need to show our credit score, we can use an ITIN. Yes. So again, not the next webinar, but the webinar after that, we'll talk about how to build credit. And you can build credit using an ITIN. Yes, so that, and again, the whole purpose of all of these numbers, the ITINs, the EINs, is really just to have a track record of your credit and a track record of your taxes. That's the entire purpose of this, very much disconnected from immigration authorities. All of this is really intended for any individual, any foreign individual to come and conduct business in the US. Any other questions, comments? Well, thank you so much for joining me. I'm very excited about our next webinar, which again will be on choosing a business structure. So the next webinar will focus a lot more on really launching your business. So these couple of webinars have been really focused on independent contracting to provide you with a very general overview of what it means to work as an independent contractor. But for folks who are interested in launching their business or who are interested in helping their family start a business, the next few webinars will specifically focus on partnerships, on limited liability corporations, worker cooperatives, access to financial capital, so a lot more in-depth information about formal businesses. We're also, like I mentioned again at the beginning, looking to partner with organizations and individuals who can share their personal experience as entrepreneurs. So I'm very excited about what's to come. So again, thank you very much. Sorry, one last question that came in. What if I never got a credit card when I was undocumented, but I now have a Social Security number through DACA? Do I still need to contact credit bureaus to tell them I now have a Social Security number? No, that's a good question. In that sense, if you never build credit without a Social Security number, then there is no reason to send your information to the credit bureaus. It's only if you did build some type of credit before. So with that, I am going to end this webinar. And again, thank you so much. Feel free to email me. Feel free to connect with me on social media. Okay, everybody, have a good night.